Welcome to our 12th unit dealing with the philosophy of the English and British empiricists. This presentation will be in two parts. We're going to follow a slightly different method for making the presentations in this unit. So a little bit of an explanation. Don't forget to print the worksheets off. It'll help you to follow. I've combined both the worksheet and the study questions. The study questions are in italics, so you'll be able to follow that through when you print it off. And you may, when I finish this introduction, you may want to print that off or take a break. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at materialism and idealism as examples of metaphysical monism. In the case of materialism, we've already spent time in Unit 10 dealing with Thomas Hobbes, so a very, very brief reflection there. But in terms of idealism, we're going to focus on George Berkeley. I'm putting these two things, materialism and idealism, together so that you can see the connections. Two different responses to the question of how do you relate two substances, one being material and one not being a material substance, body and soul, heaven and earth, forms and objects, whatever division you want. A challenging topic, to say the least. So we'll deal with that. And then we'll go on and look at George Berkeley in some detail. There's a problem, however, in doing this. The logical problem is that George Berkeley historically comes after John Locke. And as we're making our way through the presentation on George Berkeley, you're going to hear me referring it, I'm saying, to the need for you to perhaps come back and reflect upon what George Berkeley was saying in the light of what we have discussed in relation to John Locke. And that will be the only, if I curveball, that you'll get in this type of presentation. We're then going to summarise briefly the whole development of empiricism, focusing on some important aspects as we get ready for John Locke. That's part A. Part B, we're going to look at John Locke, Hume, causation and substance. So if you would print this off, let's prepare ourselves to start on Unit 12, Part A. So with that in mind, let's just go on and briefly look at the general setting of the British empiricists. It was getting ready for Kant's famous so-called epistemological revolution. This is the post-Reformation and the counter-Reformation era in Europe. A great deal of turmoil taking place, political, religious and philosophical. I've listed some themes for you that you might find interesting that are going on in the background. The movement in philosophical thinking that was taking place, the great change that was coming was in terms of the use of experience for knowledge alone, and it was empiricism. But also at the same time, with the rise of that approach to knowledge, there was a rise of a struggle over what's called meaninglessness. And while that's not part of our course, when you're going through this era, you might want to follow that theme. Why did that become part of many major philosophical views of meaninglessness? Well, I'll let you look at the other things. You can see here, I'm missing some key people for you in this era. We're not going to spend time on Benedict Spinoza. He's a very important figure. Nor will we spend time on the American philosopher-theologian Jonathan Edwards. Edwards had profound impact in the philosophical views of our community in terms of the 1900s, really quite a significant player there. Not today, and partly because he was president of Princeton for many years. And we'll be going on to talk about Kant next time. So with that in mind, let us now move back. In fact, you'll see the colour of the slides will indicate to you that we're going back to Unit 10 and to that discussion of materialism which revolved around this discussion of metaphysical dualism. Metaphysical dualism is that doctrine that there is fundamentally two substances that make up reality. And it's probably fair to say that most people instinctively are dualists. They believe in, if you like, some sense of the continuity of personhood after death, body and soul, if you will, some sense that there's more to life than the mere physical. So the idea that it's possible to have a substance which is not material. But many rejected that view and felt that they were left with a metaphysical choice. Pluralism was out of the question, even though it was one of the views of the pre-Socratics. They saw that you could either have matter as being the only thing that was real, or you could have mind that was the only thing that was real. And of course, when it comes to matter, that is our friend Thomas Hobbes, which we've talked about him already, and his profound influence, particularly in relation to materialism and determinism. Today we're coming to Berkeley, and Berkeley is an illustration of the idealists. The next slide is taking you back to what we previously looked at, giving you some background of what we said about the materialism. Here we come to idealism, which is the general position from which George Berkeley is going to be doing his philosophy. Now, George Berkeley also is an empiricist. That is, he believes the only way we can know things is through experience. We'll comment on that in a moment. But we need first to separate, this confusion seems to come up every time we teach Berkeley, that when we use the word idealism in philosophy, we're not using it, the concept of an ideal, perfect, a paradise, but rather we're using it as and I've got it in blue for you on the screen, the mind in some sense is ultimate, and that all other things are reducible to mind and ideas. You'll find that idealism is defined around those concepts. Bottom line is, often there's only one thing that's real, that is the mind and its associated ideas. And Berkeley's going to tell us that the ideas are the only things that are real, because he's going to fit into the category of subjective idealism. Objective idealism, the big two divisions in idealism. The objectives say that things exist apart from our perception of them. You can see that if I'm thinking about this table that's in front of me today, this desk, and I'm looking at it, I'm experiencing it, and I have that idea of it in my mind. If I walk out my door and go around the corner, I can no longer experience the table. The objective idealist says, well, that idea represents something that still exists. Subjective idealism, on the other hand, says that things only exist so long as they're being perceived. They require someone to be perceiving them for them to exist. So in the sense in which this desk again, I'm perceiving it now, when I walk out there and turn around the corner, it no longer exists. That's going to raise another question, but we'll deal with that when we come to Berkeley proper. Well, let's turn our attention to George Berkeley. Berkeley was born in Ireland, in County Kilkenny. He went to Kilkenny College, and then on to Trinity in Dublin. He graduated the BA, and eventually was elected a fellow at the college in 1717. And he received that position primarily through his writings and further work, and he stayed and was involved with Trinity, which was very much his academic home and background. However, having said that, we have to pause and realise with Berkeley, he had a very public life as well. He lived during a time of considerable struggle. There was a great political battle between the Tories and the Whigs. The Whigs represented those who, in a sense, represented the political ideas of John Locke, where you had what in Britain is usually called responsible government, where the government is in the hands of the people through the Parliament, and the monarch's role, in a sense, is subservient to that. If you like, Parliament is supreme. On the other hand, the Whigs, particularly at a time Berkeley is alive, this is the move from the 17th to the 18th century, from the 1600s to the 1700s. In that period of time, there's great turmoil in England and associated Scotland and Ireland over the relationship between the monarchy and the Parliament. It had been going on for 100 years. And at that particular time, Berkeley is supporting the Whigs. And effectively, they are trying to argue for the divine right of kings. They're not continuing to argue for the absolute monarch power, an absolute monarch, but they're very concerned about who was to be king. And Berkeley was a strong supporter of the Hanoverian house. You might wonder what that's all about. In 1688, William of Orange, who was married to a Stuart, Mary, and he was invited by the Parliament to lead an invasion and drive out the last of the Stuart kings. Upon Mary and William's death, the kingdom passed to Mary's sister, Anne, who became queen, and she reigned until the next possible connection, Protestant connection, which was the George I, who was if you like, a German family, who became the first King George I of England. But by the way, he had difficulty even speaking English. Interesting background to that. But Berkeley was a supporter of this Hanoverian house and the recognition of the Protestant leadership and the role of a Protestant king in England. And remembering, of course, from our previous discussions that the king in England was also head of the Church of England. Well, back to Berkeley. He was part of this public debate, and he was, in a sense, very popular with the Tory party. And he eventually was consecrated bishop, the Anglican or Church of England bishop in Dublin. He was 49 when he received that position, and then eventually took his seat in the House of Lords, in the Irish House of Lords. He was a family man, and his wife was very social. She was very involved in the community and in the social life of the community. His wife's Julia. He had 4 sons and 2 daughters. And he remained and continued to be in the episcopal position. He travelled widely still and had enormous influence in all kinds of areas in Europe. His writings were well known. But at age 77 he retires and goes to Oxford and eventually dies shortly after that. A controversial figure, but certainly well known. Well, what do you need to take out of our discussion of Berkeley today? We're about to have this discussion. What should you be able to do? You should be able to accurately translate SES Percepi and know what it's all about. You need to be aware of the 5 points of subjective idealism, and that's going to be an issue you're going to have to come back to perhaps after you've had the discussion of Locke. You need to know what solipsism is, be able to explain God's role in Berkeley's idealism and his view of creation. And all of these views have profound impact in other areas, so we'll leave them there. His famous treatise is given there. You can see that. We'll come to that. Let's now briefly talk about his idea. Remembering that idealism is a radical solution to the mind-body problem. Now, it comes about because how do you explain the relationship between mind and body? All right, if you're a dualist, I'm a dualist. How do I explain body and soul? How do I explain mind and matter? Mind is distinct from the brain. I do not see the brain as merely being a mechanical thing. It's just too creative, and there are too many things about the mind that are so deep and wonderful. It's got to be more than simply body. But I can't explain the relationship of it. It's one of the difficult things. Descartes' solution, of course, you remember, was interactionalism. The mind interacts with the body. Well, that's lovely. How do you do that? Well, Berkeley says, well, through the pineal gland. Well, today the pineal gland had nothing to do with that. But anyway, it's also difficult to explain the reality of a material substance and an immaterial substance, one that you can't see. Well, Berkeley felt he had the answer. And he's not going to assert idealism, that the only thing are minds and ideas, but he's going to assert subjective idealism. And what's more, he wanted to establish a very strong ground for subjective idealism. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, as soon as you become a subjective idealist, remember what it says, that for something to exist, it can only exist whilst being perceived. And this raises the question of epistemological solipsism, or solipsism. I've got the blue on the screen for you. It's that variety of idealism that asserts that all that can be known for certain is one's own consciousness or one's own mind and one's own ideas. Now, of course, once you stop perceiving, all those ideas have gone forever. So existence becomes very, very dependent upon perception. And that's the problem of subjective idealism. Well, what's going to be his solution to that? Well, before we get to his solution, let me just point out to you these 5. I've summarized them for you here, the 5 proofs for subjective idealism. In other words, Berkeley was very concerned to be able to prove this. He first addresses the mind-body problem. He then has an interesting discussion which picks up on some of the work of Kant and others, and indeed Locke, and says that matter is a meaningless idea. It's a very interesting discussion. It's an interesting discussion about the unexperienced as inconceivable, because once you've experienced it, it no longer exists, etc. In a sense, he's following Locke's arguments in reasons 1 to 3. But 4 and 5, he's beginning to separate himself from Locke, because Locke was insistent on primary and secondary qualities, and the primary qualities were upheld by substances. So he wants to reject the concept of substance. Well, I'll let you come back to those. And if you're writing on Berkeley in your essay, you're probably going to have to have more time on this. And if you decide to write on Berkeley and go to cover the 5 proofs, you can contact me by email and I'll give you some more material for reading. Really, as far as we're concerned, in this course, as we go through it as a whole, unless you're writing an essay on Berkeley, is that you know about the 5 proofs, have an understanding of them. Let's come to his solution to the problem inherent in subjective idealism. He wants to make an assertion. He wants to join this statement and say, to be is to be perceived. And this is where we got the SES percepi, or percipi, living last pronunciation. I had my Latin in another place, and you'll probably hear different pronunciations of that, but basically SES percepi. Esse, to be, est is, and percepi, to be perceived. You need to recognise this, just as you need to for cogito ergo sum and other key ideas throughout the course, and be able to translate it correctly. Note the verbal structure in terms of to be, and follow the right verbal structure. Is to be. Don't change the tenses of the verbs for various reasons. The next is, you want to read these next 2 comments again after we've done Locke. I will leave you to come back to those, as long as you understand the starting point was SES percepi. What he wants to do is to go on from there, and he wants to argue that he's got a rational argument. In other words, he puts in the form of a syllogism, to argue, well, let's have a look at the syllogism, it's simple to do that. All ideas exist only in minds, all things are ideas, therefore all things exist only in minds. He wants a watertight argument in his attack on his arguments in favour of subjective idealism. And secondly, he wants to tie it down that all things exist only in minds. Now, note the phraseology. Then the second premise, all things are ideas. And now the first premise, all ideas exist only in minds. Now those two things are interesting. Whether the second premise is correct is a different debate. I'll let you read some of the discussions about that. All I'm doing here is driving home the point that he's going to say SES percepi. To be is to be conceived, to be is to be perceived. And he's tied this down in two ways. First, by establishing the validity of subjective idealism, and second, saying here is a rational argument defending it. Well, how does he get round the solipsism problem? I mean, he's not a solipsist, I can assure you, as we'll see in a moment. But yet he's wanted to assert subjective idealism. Surely, by definition, he falls into the solipsist problem. Well, the problem here is, and note this, Berkeley doesn't say all things exist in our mind, but rather all things exist in some mind. Go back to SES percepi. To be is to be perceived. Remember I said the verbal structure is important. He's not saying to be, I have to be perceived in my own mind, or I have to be perceiving myself, or just to be perceived. Well, his answer, of course, is that he brings God into the picture. That shouldn't surprise us. This is an era when God often appears in philosophy. He says God is the constant perceiver of all things. His thesis goes like this. There is an infinite mind that exists, God's mind. And God is constantly perceiving everything. And if God is constantly perceiving this table, whether I'm here or outside, this table continues to exist in the mind of God. In this case, Berkeley is building upon, if you like, building a bridge between Christian theology and philosophy. And it's not surprising then that he has a view of creation. His view is that God is constantly perceiving the world. At this very moment and at every moment, God is creating this world and sustaining it by his continual perceiving of it. There's a typo there. Well, we'll come back to that later. Let's summarize. And here's a little summary for you. All things are ideas. Human minds are finite. And while they can create ideas, they can't uphold substances. However, there's another mind. The mind is an infinite mental substance. Who is perceiving things at all times? And who is that? God, of course. When reflecting upon Berkeley's views, many students find it difficult to take him seriously for 5 minutes. I'd like to just remind you that these are, the philosophers we consider in this course are great philosophers, had profound impact on Western thinking and Western philosophy. And so I think William James has a word of advice to us all. I've got it in italics there for you. Are your objections to a matter of philosophy, are your questions a matter of philosophy or psychology? And he goes on to say that the history of philosophy is often to be viewed as a clash of temperaments. In other words, separate your feelings from your reasons. In my view, there's some problems with Berkeley's views. As the thing of imagining and perceiving, imagining and conceiving. Anyway, I'll just leave you to see those objections there. I don't want to spend much more time on Berkeley, mainly because I want to come back here. As far as this course is concerned, I want you to be able to accurately translate ex percepi and recognize it. Be aware of those 5 points of subjective idealism, proofs of subjective idealism. Be able to understand solipsism and be able to understand how Berkeley overcomes that with God being the perceiver of all things and how God is perceiving everything and maintaining it and upholding it. Now, let's move from this discussion of materialism and idealism, the two monistic, metaphysical monism approaches, and let's begin now to come back to empiricism, proper British empiricism. And to do that, let's just take a brief moment, A, to remind ourselves some of the background, and B, to set in mind some other materials that will help you if you're going to write an essay. Many of you have chosen to do, it's always the case, Locke is very popular for an essay topic. I would encourage you to take note of some of the suggestions on the side I'm making as we go through to help you with your essays. By now we're, I think, familiar with the concept of empiricism in general. Ed Miller has a way of describing it as being the theory that all knowledge of actual and existing things is derived through the 5 senses. Very simple and straightforward. Remember, Aristotle had an approach, as did Aquinas. They are both following in the empiricist tradition, established one and truly by Aristotle. And they're laying the foundation of the modern empiricists, particularly the British empiricists, and with all the strengths and the weaknesses of that system. And all I've done on this slide is remind you of some of the struggles that both Aristotle and Aquinas had in trying to deal with universals. Are you aware of those? As we come into the so-called modern era, we're post-Descartes, we're beginning to look at the British empiricists who really march us into the modern era. What's important to remember, then the post-Renaissance era, post-Renaissance and Reformation era, the emphasis became upon insisting that nothing could be learnt that was meaningful or certain or real. No, that's not true. Nothing could be learnt that was meaningful from innate or self-evident truths. That's an assumption being repeated and repeated. In other words, only one way and one way only. I would suggest to you that that's an error. And in regard to errors, as you look at this matter, you're writing an essay. Remember, you've got to be critical in your reviews. How can I help you? One hint there. The very helpful work on this is the first 3 chapters of Mortimer Adler's work called 10 Philosophical Mistakes. You may not have heard of Mortimer. He died in 2001. And he was famous for the working together with the then president of the University of Chicago to produce the great works for the works, in fact, they're behind me here in my library, called The Great Books. Controversial character, that work was very much a part of what St. John's University is all about. He was a scholar. He was professor of philosophy of law in Chicago. He was involved with many other groups. He was a prestigious person. His philosophy was basically in the tradition of